So, and however that goes, we've just got some time for you to really get your heads across it as much as possible. So, who's kicking us off? Greg. Now, I'm going to give you, are you happy to have that?
Yeah, sure.
And do you need the clicker? Do you want me to click for you?
I'll say click. That'd be great.
Or you can click, because you can see on the screen there. Yeah, that's one, yeah. Okay, off you go.
Right, well...
Is it on?
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for the opportunity to...
I fix it for you.
Testing. So, thank you for the opportunity to present to you today and to talk about the process that the Royal Commission went through in its inquiry. That's what we'll focus on in this short session. We don't have a lot of time, so we'll cover it in fairly at a high level. And then in the session just after lunch, we'll talk more about the findings and the recommendations. But I appreciate that some of you have travelled a little way to get here, and it's the weekend, so I appreciate you giving up your time to listen to us. I guess the first thing that I'd note is that this is it's a fairly complex, it's an emotive, and it's an important subject, I guess, for the state to debate properly. There's a lot of hubris and misinformation out there with respect to this topic, and as the Royal Commission found, there's a fair bit of time and effort that needs to go into actually sorting out fact from fiction, and I think that's going to be partly your challenge as well. We had the advantage, I guess, of having what was close to 15 months to actually do nothing else but investigate this topic. And as I said, there was a lot of detail to get around. Before I get into it, just a quick intro of both of us. As was just mentioned, my name's Greg Ward. I was the Chief of Staff for the Royal Commission. I came to this without a background in the nuclear industry. I knew pretty much nothing about it. My background was military, government and business type roles. So I certainly came to it with a fresh perspective. I came to it ready to learn. I guess I was a little bit sceptical about the motives for those that supported the industry and for those that opposed it. I guess also that I wasn't too certain whether this was a good thing or a bad thing, and it took me probably about 6 to 9 months before I got comfortable enough that I understood what was a fact and what wasn't, and started to form my views. After this, I'm going on to other things that aren't related to the nuclear industry.
I'm Chad Jacobi. I'm a public lawyer. For about the last decade, my responsibility was to act for the government in criminal prosecutions as well as in constitutional law cases, essentially doing court work. At the end of the commission, I've left government, and I'm about to go to the independent bar and work for myself. I had no background in nuclear when I started, and I have no expectation of being involved in nuclear at any point in the future, other than Saturdays, speaking about what the Commission did. So I'd echo everything that Greg said in terms of my expectations about what we were going to learn. I think that you're going to face very much the same challenge that we faced coming into it. I certainly had no preconceived view about whether this would be a good thing or a bad thing in any respect. And I think perhaps I'll hand over to Lucy, who was part of our team.
Thanks. Yeah, very similar to Chad's background. I'm a public lawyer for the state government, have been for about the last 15 years, predominantly in an advisory role, dealt with a number of different areas, constitutional, administrative, had a bit of background in energy and electricity law. But I really came into the Royal Commission process seeing it as just a really interesting topic, an interesting challenge, something I didn't really know much about. And so I can feel hopefully a bit of empathy for all of you embarking on this, the start of this process as well. So hopefully we can help share a bit about what we learned, and we're really open to speaking to anyone over lunch or, you know, as and when that works.
Thank you. So I guess we'll start by running through the process that the Royal Commission went through. Some of these slides I appreciate you've probably seen. The Commissioner had a little video up, which I'm assuming most of you have seen, so you will recognise some of the slides. But the terms of reference were what we were required to work to. We needed to look at the entire nuclear fuel cycle, which comprised a number of elements. The first part of it, the little green dot up there, was basically looking at the exploration and extraction, mining of radioactive materials. So we were required to look at whether or not there was any opportunities, any additional risks associated with those, to increase the mining activity that the state already undertakes. As you may well be aware, Australia has something like 30% of the world's natural uranium, and South Australia has about 80% of that. So we're a significant player already in terms of uranium that's fed into the world market. We're also required to look at whether or not there was any opportunities to add value to the uranium that we mine. At the moment, we dig it out of the ground. That uranium oxide, or yellow cake, which you may have heard of, is shipped overseas, and there is no value adding done to it here in Australia. And by value adding, we were talking about the process of conversion, enrichment and fuel fabrication. Conversion is basically taking that uranium ore and turning it into a gas, which is then fed into the enrichment process, which is really about trying to increase the concentration of uranium, in fact, a particular isotope of uranium, up to around 4% from a natural 0.7%. And that's required in order to be able to be used to power a nuclear power plant. Those little pellets that result from that are then put into fuel assemblies, and that's the process of fabrication. And it's those fuel assemblies that then go into the red dot up there, which is the nuclear power stations. We're required to look at whether or not it made sense to produce electricity from nuclear power plants. Once the used fuel comes out of a power plant, one of two things can happen. It can either be reprocessed, and uranium that's in the system can be reused, and it also reduces the volume. Sorry, someone pointing over here. The volume of the waste stream. Or alternatively, it can be taken in the form that it comes out of the reactor and stored and disposed of in that form, which is what finally happens. And of course, there's some research, development and education that goes around that. And I've probably had my 2 minutes on that bit. We were supposed to look at this in terms of opportunities and risks, and in the context of the various communities in South Australia. Next slide. Well, in theory, here we go. So what do? We had a fairly short time to actually run through the depth of information that was required. This was a fairly complex topic, as we said. We had essentially a year to do it. So we've very quickly pulled together a core team of about 20 people. Those people had expertise in law, in geology, in engineering, finance, medicine, nuclear, clearly. The core team was about 20. We had another 20 or so advisors who provided support to the Secretariat, and we had some consultants that also did some work on our behalf. The first thing we did was issue a series of issues papers and asked for public feedback in the form of submissions. We gave the community 3 months to provide those written submissions. While that was happening, our internal team was doing a lot of its own research. But very early in the piece, we went to both proponents and those that were opposed to the nuclear industry, and we asked them who we should be talking to and where we should go and visit. And after coming up with a fairly long list, we developed a program of visits, initially through South Australia, where we started in regional and Aboriginal communities, and then progressed overseas to through Asia, through Europe, and over to the US and Canada as well, where we looked at nuclear facilities. We spoke with people who supported the industry, and we made a conscious effort to make sure we also met with people who were clearly opposed to it. We visited Fukushima to understand what the consequences were when things could go wrong. The second part of last year, we concentrated on a series of public sessions, and that's where we invited experts in to address particular areas that we wanted to drill down further on. In January, February this year, we spent, the team came together and we basically analysed the information that we had in order to develop some tentative findings. Those tentative findings we made public, and we asked for feedback from the public in relation to what we had found. And while that feedback was coming in, we worked hard to develop the final report, which was delivered as promised on the 6th of May this year. So that was in essence the stages that we went through. Jen?
What we at the outset did was identify pretty clearly what the principles were we wanted to act on. We picked 3, and if you were following the process earlier last year, the Commissioner was speaking about these, and they are the 3 that appear there. What I want to speak about briefly is the implementation of them. If you're interested, you'll find the discussion of this in the report in Appendix B, commencing at page 181. The key point about it being evidence-based was this, that the Commission's task, in terms of reference, was to identify the evidence that it accepted as the most credible and cogent, and that is what's reflected in its report. And so the point wasn't to balance competing passions or cases, but simply to identify what were the facts, what was in contest, seek to resolve what it could, and identify where there was disagreement, what the nature of that disagreement was. There were 4 sources of that, and Greg's already mentioned a number of them. One that will be of, given that he's already talked about submissions, I'll skip to the public sessions. The issue there was that the Commission sought to supplement the information it had received in the written submissions with further evidence. This wasn't a process of coming along and speaking about what you put in your submission. We read all of the submissions, and indeed we read all of the references that were contained in the submissions as well, collectively. The issue was that we knew that there were experts out there that we wanted to speak to that wouldn't make a submission, but we wanted to talk to, and the issue was to locate them and speak to them. So the task was to identify people that had a combination of what they had expertise by reason of either their study or their experience, and often both, that were balanced, could speak to the risks of an issue and discuss it from their either scientific, engineering or other expertise. So we called about 140 witnesses in the end across a wide range of areas. They're listed, I think, at about I think I mentioned 181, that it's about page 186, there's a big list of the witnesses that were called and the topics on which they were called. There were also some people where they put in a submission, we sought to speak to them about their submission so that we could find out what the basis for it was, but that was more limited. So that represented our best efforts in the time that we had to identify the people that we thought were expert. And you will see throughout the report references from the footnotes into the oral evidence that people gave in those public sessions, and certainly they were illuminating. The other thing I will mention is the commission studies. These were a series of studies that focused primarily on viability, though there were a number of others, one on safety cases and another on transport risks, where the commission put out a scope of work, that is, it defined the task that it wanted undertaken, and we had experts undertake that work. The views expressed were those of the expert organisation, and it was simply evidence that the commission could accept or reject as it saw fit. And so that fitted into its analysis in that way. And you'll see references throughout the report to the reports of Hatch, who did the work on further processing, the works of DGA that did the work on electricity, and the work of Jacobs that did the work on waste. That's what I want to talk about in terms of evidence, and I think Lucy's going to deal with openness and transparency and independence.
Yeah, so the second foundation principle that the Commission really wanted to adhere to as its entire process rolled out was this value of openness and transparency. We were lucky enough with our Commission and our terms of reference that we really had the freedom to do things in perhaps a slightly different way than the way you see a lot of Royal Commissions being rolled out at present. We weren't investigating something that had gone wrong in the past, and so there weren't concerns about confidentiality or liability or anything like that. So we had the opportunity really to be quite open in relation to how we went about things. And the way we tried to keep that practice going throughout the Commission was to publish a lot of the information on our website. All of the written submissions that were appropriate for publication were published. We used the website as well to live stream all of the witnesses that we heard from in the public sessions, so people were able to tap in and watch those as they were going. They were also able to view podcasts later. The transcripts were all made available on our website, and also all of the Commission studies have been published in full, along with the tentative findings and of course the final report now too. The intent was to allow people to engage with the subject matter as we were going through and engaging with the subject matter. How much that worked, I think, is open to question. Most people are pretty busy, and I think we had a core group of followers, it's fair to say. But in general, the information is all there. It's up to the community as to whether they choose to now dip into it. But it is still there. If there are areas and subject matters of interest that to any of you, I would recommend going and having a look in the topic list and the witness list and the interviews that we conducted through the public sessions. There was some terrific information that we got out of some very eminent and expert people in this area. Anyone want to jump in? No?
Yeah, I can underscore that. In a number of cases, the people we spoke to were very, very difficult to organise and get. And we were able to ask them questions that related specifically to the circumstances and challenges that we faced, and indeed the sorts of questions and issues that you faced. So if you are interested, I'd certainly encourage that, and we're more than happy over lunch. If anyone's interested to talk to us, we can tell you who we thought good people were on particular topics and so on. So, and
the final principle was of independence. Now that's obviously fundamental to and having a process that has integrity. You heard a little bit about all of our backgrounds. We were a core part, I guess, of the leadership team within the Commission. None of us had a background in the industry. None of us are continuing in the industry. None of us had preconceived ideas. That was the case for the majority of the Commission staff. There were some who clearly had relevant experience and expertise in areas, and certainly we had to speak to a lot of people in the industry. If you want to understand how the safety systems in a nuclear power plant work. You go and speak to someone who builds a nuclear power plant and ask what makes sense. I never had the sense that there was anything predetermined in our process. We were left to do our jobs, and we were left to do them thoroughly. The Commissioner had high expectations of all of us in that regard, and I'm very comfortable that the result of the report is an independent analysis.
I think what we might do now, until somebody waves their hands and says stop, is take questions from the floor. So feel free to ask away.
Sure, thanks.
Thanks. Am I on? Okay. So it's a long-term project that you guys were working on, preparing this report. You had a hard deadline, I guess it's safe to say. Were there, in the work that I do, I have similar sorts of pressures. And in the work that I do, I usually get the sense from both myself and my colleagues that there are things that we could have done better, or things that we feel are kind of incomplete, but due to commercial time, whatever other pressures, didn't result. Do you feel that the report is complete to the best of infinite resources, or do you feel like you ran out of time and you needed to, not cut corners, I'm not trying to be offensive, but is there something that you feel like, I wish I could have looked, or we could have looked more deeply into X?
I think the first thing I'd say is that we could have been doing this for years, and you could get into great depths in each one of these areas that we looked at. I think, in summary, no, we felt that we had sufficient time to do justice to the terms of reference that we were given. We had a fairly clear plan from day one. We had a lot of moving parts happening in parallel.
You can gather Greg was the taskmaster.
So, yes, whilst it was challenging, we certainly we didn't have time to rest on our laurels, that's for sure. But no, I'd have to say that the process that we ran through, the people that we talked to, the evidence that we collected was fairly extensive, and that as a group we had sufficient time to do it justice.
Can I just chime in? I think the issue you raise is a real one. And the way that we managed it is that to the extent to which we weren't satisfied of something, we've indicated that there would need to be further work done in particular areas. Now, I don't think anybody's pretended that, with respect to these matters, that that there aren't further steps that you would need to take as a matter of investigation, and that's where the Commission has pointed. So that I think is the way that I'd answer the question that you asked, that we made, and certainly I can indicate that from a personal point of view, I am satisfied of the matters to a very high standard of the issues that we expressed views about, to the extent to which we've indicated that you would need to do more, and that there will be certain work that would need to be done, in fact some of it which would be outside of the terms of reference of the Commission. We've indicated what it would be, and I think we've endeavoured in the final chapter to point to some of the sorts of things you might need to do, but that wasn't for us to flesh out.
Yeah, look, I think I'd just finish that one off by saying there is clearly still a lot of work to do. I mean, this is a lot of the analysis that we did was conceptual and high level. And if there's a desire to take this further, then clearly there's a lot more detailed work that has to go on. So we were just the start of that process, but with respect to our terms of reference, yes, we were comfortable, we had sufficient time.
I had one question. It is a very emotive issue, and we see some very strong opinions across. When you reflect back in the 15 months that the Commission was working through this whole thing, do you feel that there could have been a better change management plan or an engagement model which could have swayed? Because of course we are expected to deliver that bit of, if I can use the word sanity to the whole thing, and communicate that in as some of the people said, summarize the entire Royal Commission report, which is a very onerous exercise because many big initiatives have failed on change management bit. So do you think, when you reflect back, that there was something you could have done differently?
Well, I'd answer that by saying that as a Royal Commission, our job wasn't to convince the public that this was good, bad or otherwise. Our job was to actually try and get to the facts, the evidence, to understand it and to draw some conclusions and make some recommendations. So we could have, quite frankly, we could have done it behind closed doors if we wanted to and still produced a valid report. But we acknowledge that this was something that the whole community needed to understand. If the findings and the recommendations were actually to be taken further, then the community clearly had to understand what was being discussed. So we took a conscious effort right at the beginning, as Lucy said, to be as open and transparent and to share, to the extent that we could, the journey that we were going on with the broader community. But that wasn't, that was a side benefit, and we appreciated that if we had have put a report on the table at the end of this, without trying at least to share that process with the community, then whoever picked it up would be basically starting from square one.
This whole question is coming from the fact that we did hear that.
Sorry, we'll need the microphone if you're going to ask another question.
Because the only bit that I'm really why this question comes up is the fact that we had different diverse groups coming and presenting their submissions to the commission. So it would be really interesting to know that how wide that the groups were in terms of what all we heard and the witnesses that we got to provide submissions to the commission, and then how much that was taken into consideration while preparing, or it was just on the viability bit of the sides of the things.
I can indicate that I read all of the submissions. I can say I read all the submissions. Yes, I was very tired, but we genuinely read what was there. We genuinely looked behind what was there. I did so at one stage because I was searching for who the people that were said to be experts in these fields were, so that I could arrange to meet them for the purposes of organising public sessions. So that was very genuine. I think, in answer to your other question, could we have done things better? Of course you can always do something better. But I think in Kevin's, and this is the Commissioner's defence, the simple fact was that I don't know a Royal Commissioner, and I've been involved in a Royal Commission back in 2005, who did more media, that spoke to on more radio. They did FM and AM and Drive and mornings, who did more public meetings, who spoke to more newspapers during the course of a Royal Commission process. I simply can't think of one. And I think from his point of view that that was very important to what he did, and I think if he was here he would say that that was something that he was doing on an ongoing basis, and they worked very, very hard at making sure that people were aware of what was being done. Now, can you engage everybody all of the time in this? Of course not. People have got their own lives, and they couldn't follow this Royal Commission and the Institutional Responses Royal Commission and the Royal Commission into the childcare system in South Australia as well. I mean, people have got their own lives and other issues that they're concerned about, but as far as the Commission could, I don't think we could have travelled more extensively. I know the roadshows we did when the tentative findings came out, we stood in rooms and explained to people what those tentative findings were and invited them to respond, and people came. So.
You said you had 20 people involved in this process of putting together 300 plus pages in a commission report and came up with 12 recommendations. Within those 20 people, was there a consensus that those 12 recommendations were about what the whole thing was about? Because we've got 50 people here that's got to come up with consensus after 4 days, and you guys have been involved in 15, 16 months. And while you can read 330 pages of data, you've been involved in these people talking to you, etc. Those recommendations, do you think that you had consensus that that was the way to go?
Well, it took me, as I said, 6 to 9 months just to understand, what was a fact and what wasn't. And I think it's also fair to say that, that there were a variety of different views amongst the core team on the Royal Commission. So at the end of the day, though, you know, we debated this internally. It wasn't just the commissioner sitting there, you know, making decisions. He encouraged everybody in the team to share their views, and if there was a different view, to explain and try and understand why people had those views. But I think in general, and I don't want to talk for each of the individuals out there, but I think as a general rule, we were pretty united in the findings and the conclusions that we drew in the report.
Any over that side? You okay? Yes.
Ready? My question is that the nuclear...
Yeah, it's on.
Sorry. My question is that the Nuclear Royal Commission took all of its recommendations were evidence-based. What I'm asking is, there is no evidence for underground storage. Just a little bit up. Do you know what I'm saying? That there is no evidence to call on for underground storage because no one has done it yet. Okay,
I'll just step back. You're right in the sense that nobody has. I mean, there is no. Well, I guess there is one. There's the waste isolation plant in the US, which actually has been storing waste of a similar nature, albeit it's not used fuel, which is specifically what we're talking about. But countries around the world, and I could run off you know, there's Finland, there's Sweden, Switzerland, Belgium, France, the US, elsewhere, the list goes on, have been studying deep geological storage for decades, 30 or 40 years or more. And most of those countries actually have underground research laboratories in the environments in which they plan to dispose of this, where they've actually been running tests over those decades to test the concepts.
That was my concern, that for all these years they've been doing tests, but they've never actually done it.
No, they haven't actually done it because up until now they really haven't had to. They haven't had to dispose of anything. I mean, this stuff has been collecting over time. It's been stored. It has to cool down, and we'll talk more about this in the session afterwards. But you know, there's a period of time where you have to cool this stuff down and let it settle before you actually bury it. So, for a period of time, you know, it hasn't been an immediate requirement to actually bury this stuff, and these countries that have been exploring this have been taking the time, I guess, to make sure that they really understand how this would work. They've been working on developing the safety cases so that they can satisfy their own communities and their regulators that, you know, this is safe and can convince them of that. But the time is rapidly coming where some of these countries are now at a point where they need to start disposing of this waste, and Finland at the moment is probably leading the pack there, and they will be starting to dispose of some of their waste in about 4 or 5 years' time, closely followed by a few other countries, France and others.
Hello. Yeah.
Hi.
I just wanted to see what your personal experience was when you went to Fukushima, to what you learnt from that trip as well.
Well, yeah, I guess I'll have to talk to that one. Look, it was very sobering, to be quite honest, to go to Fukushima and to witness the impact that that community had experienced. Now, we've got to remember, when we're talking about Fukushima, it was first of all hit by a rather large tsunami which killed 15,000 or more people and basically wiped whole communities away. So one of the first things I noticed was the impact of that tsunami and the devastation that had caused. Clearly the tsunami then created a problem for the Fukushima nuclear power plants. And the impact of that was basically the fact that they had to evacuate, communities that hadn't been impacted by the tsunami. They had to evacuate them to minimise their exposure to some of the radioactive waste that, the fallout from the nuclear power plants. So, it was quite sobering driving through these communities, watching but basically they were in the state that they were in when people evacuated, and the trees were starting to grow over them, and the vegetation was returning. There was also a lot of activity around those communities where they were basically decontaminating the area, and people were starting to return to some of those communities, but there were communities, quite frankly, that won't go back for many more years, I guess, before they're and that was in the immediate vicinity of the actual power plants. The power plants themselves, I mean, it was an explosion. So it was a hydrogen explosion. So, you saw the devastation, I guess, of an explosion in that sense. But one thing that really did strike me was the workforce, the amount of effort that's going into actually decommissioning those power plants. It was a huge operation, and will be going on for a couple more decades before they've actually finished packing it all up and putting it away. So I think one thing that struck me is that those sorts of accidents can be quite devastating, on the immediate communities, and clearly they're things that the industry and governments and regulators really want to spend a lot of time to make sure that those sorts of things don't happen again. I guess 2 points there, though. One thing we did find is that there was a lot of lessons learnt and have been started to be implemented as a result of both Chernobyl before that and Fukushima, and that a lot of the technologies that are embedded in nuclear power plants nowadays are quite different to those. So both Chernobyl and Fukushima were 1960s type technologies, and there were some design issues clearly with them. But yeah, very interesting.
Hello, Greg. Hi.
Hi.
I've been asked to ask a question on behalf of one of the jurors here, which is what are the alternatives you looked at for disposal of nuclear waste, and was digging a big hole in the ground the best thing that people could come up with?
Okay. Well, we looked at a lot of ideas that are floating around there. I mean, people have been floating ideas for many years, from firing this stuff into space to reprocessing or doing all sorts of things. And we looked at all of those. Some of them were quite fanciful, to be quite frank, and would never happen. But I have to say that there was pretty much universal agreement around the world, and that was from both the industry and from those opposed to the industry, that deep geological storage was the most effective and the best way to deal with used fuel and nuclear waste. So I guess we didn't have to explore some of these more fanciful ideas too much, because pretty much everyone we spoke to said, well, this is the way to deal with it. We've been studying this now for 30 or 40 years, and we're pretty much convinced that this is about the best way to do it.
to direct the person that asked that question to the report, you can pick up where we went with respect to that issue. Finding 68. It's on page 83. There's a finding with respect to there being a view that there's an international consensus now that geological disposal is the best technical solution currently available. The basis for that can be found in a footnote, but I can just paraphrase it in this way, that there are other techniques that have been used. One is a closed fuel cycle method, which is the reprocessing idea, which is the French, but though they will be, and they are exploring GDF as well. The issue is that there have been a number of commissions done in a range of countries for determining their own domestic solutions as to what the best technique is. The most recent is the one of the United States that was done following the Yucca Mountain, the circumstances of Yucca Mountain no longer proceeding, which is called the Blue Ribbon Commission. It was a presidential commission under Obama. It reached the conclusion that GDF was the best technically available method currently available. And there are a range of other analyses that have been done in other countries, including Canada, the United Kingdom, and I think a number of the European countries as well. Indeed, that's the reason that Finland has gone down the road it went down.
In 100 years' time, do you think that's the best they'll still do?
Well, I was just about to go there. There are probably two. There are two feasible alternatives to a point. Chad just mentioned reprocessing. But at the end of the day, reprocessing would reduce the volume of the waste that you would need to dispose of, but you still have to dispose of elements of it, so it doesn't solve the problem. The other potential change would be what's called advanced reactor technologies, and these are some of the generation 4 reactors that are talked about, which still aren't. I mean, they're not commercially produced at the moment, and probably won't be for another couple of decades, to be honest. But what they do is actually reuse some of that waste that is generated. But notwithstanding that, there is still a component of waste that still has to be dealt with. So whichever path you go down, there will always be some waste. It might be just the volume of it that varies a little bit, that needs to be disposed of, and that is where the world's basically come to the conclusion that deep geological storage is the way to go.
When I was reading about the radiation risks, and you mentioned things about what happened in Chernobyl and in the Japanese case, I also was looking about, it's not the best example to analyze what happened after the atomic bomb in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Why the Commission didn't report to us the effect of radioactivity in these two populations? Sorry to use the word the best example, but is that not where we should obtain the consequence of radioactivity?
Well, we did. I mean, the body of knowledge out there about radiation, its effects on humans and the environment, comes from a number of sources. I mean, the impact on the community in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, back in World War II, has clearly been studied over a long period of time, as has been the impact on the communities from Chernobyl and to a lesser extent Fukushima, simply because it was only 5 years ago that happened. And that's just one example of populations that have been exposed to the results of something that's gone wrong from a nuclear power plant, or in the case of Japan, Nagasaki and the like, a nuclear weapon. But there are lots of studies being undertaken, have been over many years in universities and the like around the world, to look at it from other angles as well. So I think there's a fair body of knowledge on what radiation, the physics of radiation, and the extent or the impact of that on humans. There is a I'd have to say that there's a cloudy area, and that's largely around the impact of low doses of radiation on humans. I was going to talk a little bit more about that in the next session. But I guess the point that I would make here is that sitting here right now, we're all exposed to radiation. It's just natural background radiation, and that varies quite significantly depending on where you're sitting in the world. I mean here, to use a term, it's somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 millisieverts, which is a term you'll get to know pretty well. You know, in the UK, it could be up to 7.5 millisieverts. If you're in Iran or India or Brazil, you know, it could be way over 20 millisieverts. In some places, over 100 millisieverts. So, you know, it varies significantly. And I guess that's where the question remains at the moment. You've got some people that think that every neutron will do you damage. So in other words, just sitting here absorbing it now is causing you problems. You've got others who would argue that actually small amounts of radiation actually has a beneficial effect on your immune systems. But there's certainly no, I'd have to say there's no universal agreement at this point.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to that as well. Our terms of reference really required us to look at the particular industries around the nuclear fuel cycle, so mining for the processing, electricity generation, waste storage. And so what we really thought we needed to focus on are what are the radiation risks that result from those sorts of activities. And we learned that the impacts, even when things go wrong in those sorts of activities, in terms of their scale, are vastly different to an atomic bomb being landed somewhere. So it's as much as the understanding that has developed following those terrible incidents where atomic bombs were released about the impacts of very, very high doses of radiation on the body, the investigation we had to undertake was looking at much lower scale amounts of radiation even when things go wrong.
People will forgive me. I'll just refer you to a little part of the report which might help.
Guess who wrote most of the report?
Yeah, it's a personal failing. I just encourage you, there are a couple of witnesses, and the distinction between deterministic and stochastic effects, I appreciate the words won't immediately spring to mind, but the point is this: deterministic effects deal with very, very high doses of radiation from the sorts of circumstances that you're talking about, the detonation of an atomic weapon deliberately involving the dispersal of radionuclides over a population, where you get very severe doses of radiation. And the only people that I understand that received deterministic effects were some emergency workers at Chernobyl. Don't quote me on this because I'm not, but they were the ones that suffered ARS, which is the acute radiation sickness. And there were a small number, they were the firefighters that died shortly thereafter. For the rest of the effects that we're looking at, they are what are known as stochastic effects. They deal with they deal with lower doses where you need to do epidemiological studies in order to determine the relationship between radiation and a particular consequence. So that's what's picked up there. But there are two people that explained this to me, and bless them because they did. One is Carl Magnus Larsson, who gave evidence. He's the head of ARPANSA. He's the former Swedish regulator. He's now the Australian regulator, and he's brilliant. He gave evidence at the Commission, and if you're interested in this topic, watch him. The other person is, and she gave outstanding evidence, is Geraldine Thomas. Geraldine Thomas is the head of the Chernobyl Tissue Bank. She is at one of the United Kingdom universities, the name of which now escapes me. And she has been involved in the long-term study of populations associated with the release of radiation from the Chernobyl incident over Western Europe, over Eastern and Western Europe. She gave excellent evidence on this topic, and her evidence is very interesting. And if you can bear watching me ask her questions, I'm not advertising, you will you'll learn a lot from her in terms of that particular issue and what the particular consequences are.
I should point out the obvious, that none of us are medical experts here. So we we asked a lot of questions, clearly, of people like those that Chad have just mentioned. But we also had a team of largely professors in oncology and radiation medicine and the like, who were part of our Radiation Medicine Advisory Committee, and we put to them the evidence that we were hearing, both, the stuff from every different angle, and also sought their advice. So we didn't just rely on trying to understand it ourselves.
Okay, we're going to take 2 more questions and then break for lunch, and we can come back. So if you've still got questions, don't worry.
Yes. In your research on the deep geological containment, I presume that you spoke to geologists. Did any of them agree on seismic stability in any area in South Australia?
At the outset, the Commission identified that its task was not to site a facility. And because that was simply not within its terms of reference. Its task was not to answer that question. The question was, could this activity be viable? What are the risks? What might the opportunities be? And what might you need to do, to paraphrase? The consequence of that was that we did not direct attention to identifying sites by reason of their suitability for the purposes of, for example, seismicity, or water, or the suitability of rock characteristics, because one of the particular issues with GDFs is that you need, there are 2 broad concepts that are explained in the report. One is a clay-based concept, the other is a hard rock concept, and that's the distinction between Finland and Sweden and the other countries. And so the question was not to do an analysis of that. We did speak to people with respect to seismicity. I'm hoping that, if I get this right, is that the evidence was from Geoscience Australia. The evidence is in the report. I think its name was Andy Barnacote. I'm glad I got that right. And he gave evidence with respect to seismicity in South Australia and the seismic characteristics of South Australia. And that's been summarised in the report. And while Greg's speaking, I'll find you the page number.
Yeah, I guess the point I wanted to make is that whilst we weren't here to pick a site, we were clearly here to determine whether or not South Australia had the characteristics which were necessary for these sorts of facilities. So yes, we looked closely at understanding the general geological characteristics of South Australia, the hydrological characteristics, seismicity, and all of those criteria which will clearly be important for selecting a site ultimately. So we satisfied ourselves that yes, South Australia does have some unique characteristics which are suitable for this sort of activity, but specifically and quite widely suitable. But we didn't pick a site.
And was that just one person's recommendation, or about suitable sites, or?
No. So we looked at, we got information from a variety of sources with respect to each of those areas. We actually had on staff our own geologists, actually 2, who, sorry?
Yes.
Yeah.
Page 89, Chad.
So we did our own research as well as calling on experts, from other organisations.
So, sorry, just related to that question here, might be a bit silly, but you mentioned that some of the countries like USA or Finland have underground research facilities that have been studying this matter for decades. Has South Australia been studying that long enough to be confident that it can happen here?
Well,
do we have the same facilities? Do we have those researches happening for decades or long enough or not?
Well, a couple of points. No, we don't have an underground research laboratory specifically focused on, the storage of used fuel. But we have very similar geology to a lot of these other countries. So the first thing I'd point I'd make is that clearly we could leverage a lot of the information that they have produced over many years. It doesn't mean that we wouldn't still want to do it ourselves here. And in part of what we modelled, we assumed that we would build our own underground research laboratory, but rather than start from scratch, we'd take the information and the knowledge from those other countries. And yeah, no, absolutely, and that's why we still need to do our own specific work to confirm that the sites that we pick are actually suitable. The other point I'd make, though, is that we have been doing underground mining in South Australia for quite a long time. So there is a fairly robust body of knowledge already in the state that is directly related or relevant to the sorts of things we're talking about here as well. So Olympic Dam, for example, is a big underground mine, which looks pretty damn similar to the underground laboratory in, say, Finland and elsewhere. It's just that they're neater and more organised and tidy, but you know, it's a similar concept.
Yeah, the answer on seismicity, someone's called it out from the audience, is 89. And if you're interested in underground research laboratories, you'll find that on 88. But please don't get the concept that this is a scientific laboratory, 10 metres down. What we are talking about is something 500 metres underground, engineered at enormous expense. And you can watch the video on YouTube of them driving down it in Finland, I am told now. It is an enormous undertaking. But the purpose of that is, of course, to test the permeability of the rock and the rock fracturing at a precise level, that is, at that site.
Just one other point there. In Finland, the geology there is largely a hard rock. So that they've been studying hard rock concepts. In Switzerland, where we went, it's hard clay, so a totally different geology and a hard clay. You head into Belgium and France, and it's a soft clay, so it's actually gooey, runny clay. So these laboratories have been established in different geologies, and I'd have to say that in South Australia we have all of those different types of geology.
Okay, my friends, it's time for a break and time for lunch. We're hitting the pause button on the Royal Commission Gurus and coming back in after lunch. Just